Welcome. I'm Dan Reed, and this is the Culinary Libertarian podcast. Thank you for listening. You can find me on social media by clicking on the social media tab on the main page of the blog, www.culinarylibertarian.com. You can also find there my Patreon button and other buttons for support. If you like what I'm doing here, feel free. I encourage you to give a donation. The Patreon page is set up for some inducements, some bribes, if you will, a handy-dandy, clever bumper sticker, or with the Culinary Libertarian logo, or for the $5 amount, the Culinary Libertarian coffee mug. You can also send me emails at dan@culinarylibertarian.com. Today, I want to talk about baking. I have cooks in the many years I've been in the kitchen always ask, how do you bake? Now, that's, pretty simple. Make dough, put it in the oven. That seems to be where many people find the trouble, is making the dough. Cooks tend to like cooking because it's got some primordial attraction, heat and fire and, Tim Allen, ooh, 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 ooh. It's fun. It's hot and sweaty, but it's fun. It's fun to make flame. It's fun to make food that tastes good. The problem most cooks have with baking is they can't just wing it. Throwing food in a pan and making it flame up and throwing some salt and pepper on it. Okay, it tastes good. It's hot, fine, great. There is a science and an order and a process to baking that should exist with cooking, but sometimes it doesn't, and that's the thing that seems to really flummox a lot of people, home bakers and professionals alike. So the secret, which isn't really a secret, to baking is follow the recipe. Lots of cooks don't want to do that. So to them I say too bad. Where with the heat of the stove, you can sort of force things to be how you want them. Flour and yeast and baking soda and buttermilk, they do not cave to the whims of the cook, no matter how hard he pushes or she pushes. So we get into this thing where it's this mysterious, I can't do that kind of a thing. And baking, while there are skills to baking for making things, say, Danish or puff pastry or croissants, making bread is easy. Making muffins is easy. And there are some processes that need to be followed. There are some steps that must be followed in order to achieve the success that you expect and that you see in your head. But once those things are figured out, it's pretty simple to do. Bread is, at its core, water, flour, salt, and yeast. And if you want to get really fancy, you can do water, flour, and salt. The yeast part comes from catching the wild yeast that lives in your house that you breathe every single day. And this is how breads were made 5,000 years ago. They were all sourdough breads. There was no choice. There wasn't commercial yeast available. So bakers back in Egypt figured out how to catch the wild yeast that lived right around where they lived. San Francisco, famous for its sourdough, does pretty much the same thing. And you can do it in your house. You've known people who have a mother for their sourdough breads, and they've been feeding faithfully for 40 years. It's the same idea. Muffins and shortbreads and cakes and cookies, do require a little bit more effort and structure, no pun intended, than making bread. There is, for example, in cookies and cakes, there is a creaming method. And you've read the recipes, they say cream the butter in the sugar. Well, what does that mean? And does it have to be butter? Well, answering those questions in reverse, yes. It has to be butter. And creaming means simply that you are using the paddle attachment or the thingies on the handheld mixer to rapidly mix the butter and the sugar together. And the purpose is to create little teeny tiny air bubbles that you can't see, with the butter and sugar forming this structure to hold the air. So while we are going to add a leavening agent, leavening is either yeast in the form of the breads, or in the case of cookies and muffins and cakes, we're using a chemical leavener called baking soda and or baking powder. And these things are going to help the cake or the cookie or the muffin rise, but what makes it really spectacular is all the little teeny air bubbles that we're able to create in the creaming process as we make our batters. Once we do that, we add some eggs, then either flour and or milk or buttermilk. There's various different ingredients for the various things we want to make, but the real foundation of these treats, cookies, muffins, cakes, is getting the bases made. Now, I'm going to make a mental note here that there are recipes you will read for muffins which say cream the butter and sugar. And I just reminded myself as I'm sitting here talking about this that muffins are actually a different kind of process. Properly made, a muffin isn't creamed. The butter for a muffin is going to be melted and added to the batter. Instead, it's a whole different process, and we'll set this straight in just a few minutes. Different process than making cakes and making cookies. So, yes, suddenly we have confusion. It's not a problem. Cookies, cakes, creaming method. Muffins is interestingly called the muffin method. And the thing like the muffin, so sugar is one of those ingredients that for everybody it appears to be a dry ingredient. Looks just like flour. It sits in a bin, sits in a bag. How could this not be a dry ingredient? Well, the reason for it not being a dry ingredient and it being a wet ingredient is the fact of its function in the kitchen, in the baking pan. It attracts water. So we're going to treat it like it is a liquid. So when we're making our muffin, we're going to put the flour, baking powder, and or baking soda, salt. If you want walnuts, chocolate chips, whatever you want, that's all going to be part of the dry. The wet's going to be the liquid butter, the eggs, the sugar, and vanilla or lemon extract or whatever kind of other flavor you want to have in your muffin. We do have a couple of other things that are going to happen in the kind of science experiment part of this program. As you put together the liquid base for your muffins, the sugar and the eggs and the butter, and if your recipe calls for it, some kind of a liquid. So sometimes it would be, I have a recipe for banana muffins. The only liquid is the pureed bananas. Most of the muffins that I make are going to have buttermilk. Sometimes they just have regular milk. That's going to be part of the wet part of the ingredients. The sugar and the butter and the eggs together are going to make a nice creamy conglomeration, a nice mix. The egg yolks, and this is where science makes people, they're kind of like, science, I can't think. Well, that's not true. Science doesn't have to be hard. It's just something that maybe people aren't familiar with, and we just need to fix that. So the butter and the sugar and the egg yolks mixed all together are going to make this nice, smooth, almost shiny mix for the wet part. Add your liquid to that, and then the folding process is putting all of the dry, the sifted flour, baking soda, and or baking powder, and salt on top of the liquid part. So the bowl needs to be big enough to be able to mix with a wide-bladed rubber spatula. And we don't want to mix much. Muffins is a thing which are very easy to overmix. And what happens when anything, cakes, cookies, and muffins, are overmixed? They become tough. Now, it's kind of like, what you're talking about. How can a cookie be tough? How can a cake be tough? Well, the answer to that lies in just developing too much of the gluten. Gluten's the thing in the bread that if we do a good job and make a nice glutinous French bread, when we pull the bread apart, the bread pulls back. It's a bit of a fight. Hey, come on, bread. Well, we don't want muffins to fight back when we pull them apart. And I've tasted muffins that are overmixed. The flavor's fine, but the texture is just a little, not so much. They don't crumble the way that you would want them to say, wow, what a spectacular muffin. Who made this thing? So how we avoid this problem is don't overmix. But what does that look like? So say 10 or 12 nice wide folds with the wide rubber spatula as you're turning the bowl, incorporating everything. If there's a couple of lumps of flour, this isn't the end of the world. We don't want to beat the muffin batter. Don't need a whisk. Don't want a wooden spoon. Really stirring that. That's going to make less than spectacular. It's okay. After you've mixed your muffin dough, let it rest for a few minutes. It's going to sit there. The baking soda, the baking powder, the leavening may start to activate because acid, baking soda, and buttermilk are going to do the same thing they do when you were a kid and put baking soda and vinegar into a test tube and put the cork on it and laughed because the cork went pew, flying off. Well, we're making gas. Yes, go ahead, laugh here. So a couple of minutes of the muffin batter resting in the bowl before you portion it into the muffin tins is not going to hurt anything. As an aside, do the exact same thing with your pancake batter. Don't overmix it. Let it rest for 5 minutes. Those lumps that are there are going to, kind of be incorporated into the batter as the leavening activates and the pancake batter increases, just starts to grow. And as you're using your disher, scooping into the pancake batter, you're going to help break up some of those flour bits as well. And by the time everything's baked, or griddled for your pancakes or baked for your muffins, you're not going to notice the difference. And you're going to have this tender pancake, tender muffin. Yes, I know, we segued into pancakes, but the process is the same. Bake them till they're done. How do I know when they're done? Well, pancakes are easy. Muffins, the toothpick test or the tester test. The little metal, my mother used to have a little metal tester with the cute little wire top. Somebody was smart. Sold a unitasker. Sorry, Alton Brown. Thing for one purpose only. So a toothpick, a wooden skewer, because everybody barbecues. Push it in the cake, pull it out, and it's clean. Muffins are easy to make, and there's a couple of recipes on the blog for those. And also, actually, there's a spectacular banana pancake recipe on the blog too. So let's go back to cakes and cookies. So the creaming process is we're going to take whole butter, unsalted please, because we don't have any control over who added the salt. And without tasting it, we don't really know how salty it is. So unsalted butter and room temperature. Well, what does that mean? This is how the room is, right? Well, yeah, kind of, because you don't have a whole lot of control over that, although air conditioning does help. Room temperature for butter should be 65-ish degrees based on a couple of fancy French pastry chefs, and Shirley Corer. And I will put a link to her book on the show notes page. She is a spectacular food scientist and has some really amazing recipes in her book. And I recommend, if you are interested in knowing more about why what happens, Shirley is the cookbook author for you. Whole butter, 65-ish degrees, because when you put it into the mixing bowl and add sugar, which might be warmer than 65 degrees, and the friction of the paddle going at a high rate of speed, you're going to change that temperature from 65 to higher pretty quickly. The reason we want butter as opposed to olive oil or margarine is a big no-no all the way around, is the butter is, let's say mostly it's 80% fat. Now, different butters will have different ratios of butter fat. Some will have a little more, some may have a little bit less. But the butter fat is important because the fat is the thing that's going to wrap around the sugar. And as the sugar sort of dissolves a little bit into the butter, that's what's going to make the air bubbles that makes the cake and the cookie even more spectacular. Margarine is mostly water, much less fat. Plus, it might have trans fats and things that we really want to avoid. So margarine is out. Lard is a great fat for biscuits, which we're not going to talk about on this episode, but biscuits are definitely a skill worth mastering, and they're easy to do. And if you just can't wait, there's a biscuit recipe on the blog. So, cookies and cakes. We're creaming the butter and the sugar. We're adding the eggs. The eggs need to be incorporated, but they don't need the full rate of speed that you had given the butter and the sugar. Then, depending on whatever the process is for the thing that you're making, cakes, oftentimes a cake that starts out with creaming the butter and sugar is going to have additions of flour and milk. They say 2 and 3. I usually do 3 and 3. That's just me. I want to finish the last addition with liquid to make sure all of the bits of flour are incorporated. This is an instance where we want to make sure we are incorporating all of the flour. However, just like the muffin, overmixing the cake, overmixing the cookie is something we want to avoid. So we know we can avoid that when the last bits of flour are incorporated into the cookie dough or the cake batter. Stop mixing. Now, we have a similarity in process for the cakes and cookies. We've done the creaming. The cake batter wants to be baked right now. The mesh we've made from the sugar and the butter and the eggs holding the air, and then the flour absorbing the liquid that's in the mix, that's kind of a delicate balance, and the weight of its own self can help squeeze those air bubbles out. So we're going to pan that up into our pans. I like to weigh them out so that they're all exactly the same. Bake them till they're done. A couple of tricks for cake doneness. The toothpick test is a very good one, but also the sides of the pan. Whatever the pan is that you're using, a bundt pan, a round cake pan, a sheet pan, when the cake begins to pull away from the edge of the pan, that's an excellent visual clue that the cake is almost certainly done. In the case of a bundt cake or a loaf cake like a pound cake, it's absolutely worth the time to take a skewer or a toothpick and double check the center. In the smaller pans like a round or a square or a sheet pan, double check anyway until you're certain you know what you're doing, but that's almost certainly going to be a done cake. It comes out, stays in the pan, goes on a rack on the counter for a minimum of 5 minutes. We want cake pans and cookies and muffins on a rack on the counter so that the heat coming off can dissipate evenly, and the rack is going to give us a little bit of air under there. We don't need a fan under there. We just need something to not trap the heat directly under the pan. After 5 minutes, cookies, cakes, muffins can come either off the pan or out of the pan. And then for the cakes, I usually tip them out, turn the pan over. So the cake pan's in my right hand. Tip it out into my left hand and lift the cake pan off. And you're saying to yourself, Reed, my cakes always pull apart and they never come out nice. So the solution to that problem is in one or two things. If you can find or make parchment rounds or parchment squares or however you get there, cover the bottom of the pan with parchment paper. That's a good way to make sure the cake comes out. But the best way to make sure the cake comes out is to do what Grandma did. Butter the pan really, really well. Put a little flour into the pan and then shake and tap and knock the pan all the way around to make sure the flour covers all of the butter. And then put whatever flour is left, put that back in the flour container. And now your pan is ready to go. You can purchase those spray releases that are designed for bakers. They have flour and aerosolized fat of a kind. You can spray that onto your pan, or you can make your own with melted butter and flour. A tablespoon of melted butter and a tablespoon of flour. Mix that together. Use your own brush. Paint that on. Homemade pan release. And it's fine. Make a bunch, especially now that we're getting toward baking time. It refrigerates nicely. Pop in the microwave, a couple of zaps at 5 or 10 seconds, just till it's melted, and you have homemade, usable, reusable, refrigeratable pan release. So, cake pan right hand, tip out to left hand, invert the cake pan. So now that the clean bottom is going to rest on the newly exposed bottom of the cake. Tip all of that over so that everything is sitting upright. Put that back on the rack and just let that sit long enough till it's cool enough to handle. That could be half an hour, maybe longer, but we don't want to do anything with the cake until it's nice and chilled and has had a chance to finally cool down to room temperature. One of the other really important things about baking anything, breads, cakes, muffins, with the exception of pancakes, the baking process doesn't end when the item comes out of the oven. So what that means is while this mess of butter and sugar and water and egg and flour and whatever else we have is in the oven, even though it looks solid, it's some sort of weird sort of liquid state, which means that the sugars are still melty, the starches haven't fully gelatinized, and the proteins are in some sort of flux before they've coagulated, but they're still doing some weird chemical stuff inside. So as the baked good sits on the counter, and bread is the most noticeable thing of these, because if you bake a good hearth bread, you'll hear it go crack, crack, crack. As it's cooling, the sugar caramelization, which is the brown part, and the starch gelatinization, which is also part of the brown part, they start to cool and they crack, and you can hear that. But as it's cooling, all of those things, the protein coagulation, starch gelatinization, and sugar caramelization, are going back to their natural room temperature states. And why that's important, if you cut into a loaf of bread before it's fully cooled, you've stopped the cooling process. So whatever would have happened with that bread, wherever it would have ended up, were it allowed to rest well until its room temperature, it's been stymied, it's been cut short. It's hard to resist the taste and the crunch and the yumminess of bread fresh out of the oven, and I know as well as anybody just how delicious that is. And when I make brioche, I break the bread law. I can't help myself. I give it a few minutes, then I cut the end off because I just have to taste that lovely bread. the rest of it, focaccia or French breads or ballons or baguettes, I'm keen to wait just because I know what's going to be at the other end of the wait. So there are recipes for some of these things on the blog. The focaccia recipe is there. There's a recipe for sunflower seed bread, which is made in a pan. So 2 things about that. You can easily omit the sunflower seeds. They're a nice garnish, which I think adds a nice crunch and flavor to the bread, but needn't be there if you don't want them. You can replace it with anything of your liking, almonds, walnuts, pumpkin seeds. That would be fun this time of year, or nothing at all. And you needn't make it in a bread pan. I chose a bread pan because it was lunch bread for the kiddos. They weren't really over the top about the seeds in their bread. They want plain bread, Daddy. No, thank you for the nuts. But that could be made into dinner rolls. It could be made into rounds, into baguettes, into ballons. Different names for basically sticks or rounds. And muffins we talked about. Cookies, there is one recipe that I know of for 2. Sorry, scratch that, 2. One is Italian anise cookies, which I know that the whole class of licorice smells isn't necessarily everybody's cup of tea. And I hate licorice candy, but the anise/fennel aroma I find intoxicating, and it's just so amazing to me. Part of it is the teleportation of smell, and I don't even really have any particularly good reason to have a memory of anise, but it reminds me of fall and Thanksgiving and Christmas, and that leads immediately into family and my mother, who absolutely loved Christmas time and loved baking and all of the Christmas cookies that she would make. So the other cookie that I know of that's on the blog is Liz's rum balls, which are curiously named for their astonishing absence of rum. But they were, of all of the cookies she made every year, the most anticipated, the most sneaked out of their containers, and the most coveted. So, she would do her best to hide them, and it never really worked. One of the 3 of us kids sleuthed them out and was eager to share the information with the other 2. So we love them. We still make them. I will put some more up as the weeks progress toward Christmas and get a nice Christmas cookie catalog going. But between then and now, there's ample time to practice baking, which is the reason I'm starting this baking podcast relatively early. So there are Halloween cookies to make to practice, the sugar cookies, and I will work to remember, if you are the cookie decorating kind of person who likes flat sugar cookies as just like a canvas, then get a pumpkin cutter, and I will have a recipe up on the blog for a cookie that doesn't spread very much and is perfect for putting, say, on a cookie stick like a lollipop and decorating with royal icing or buttercream icing or cream cheese icing or fudge icing or sprinkles or, a little bit of all of it, because we're kids at heart and it's cookies, man. So happy baking. This reminder that the blog is www.culinary.libertarian.com, and I look forward to seeing you, so to speak, on the next episode. Thank you very much.